Talk about risk management for just a moment. Now, risk management is one of the biggest pieces of network security. It begins with the process of threat modeling. Now, what's a threat? A threat is any agent that is going to cause harm to an asset. What's an asset, you might be asking? Well, an asset is anything that is valuable to me or my company. If I have a company, most likely I have information about customers or products, something like that stored on a server. Now that information is an asset to me. And there's lots of agents that can cause harm to that information. Whether it be a natural disaster like a flood or a lightning strike that destroys that server, destroys that data, could be a malicious individual who breaks in and either deletes that information or modifies that information. Each of those are agents that could cause harm to an asset. I'm going to lose money or lose time, lose productivity because of the damage done by that particular agent. So the first step here is threat modeling, determining what the threats that we face are. Now this is a process essentially considering all of the different ways that harm could befall our network, our devices, our information, and our employees. And as you can imagine, that becomes a very exhaustive list. There are a lot of threats, though some of them are not very serious, some of them are very serious. So threat modeling is looking at all of the different threats and what's going to happen as a result of that, or what assets are at risk because of that particular threat. Which leads us into the next activity, which is risk analysis. We're going to look at all of the threats that we've figured out. We're going to consider each and every one of them, and we're going to determine two things for each threat. We're going to determine probability and impact. The probability, of course, is how likely that threat is to occur. So if we say lightning is going to destroy our data, well, depending on where we live, how likely are lightning storms? How likely is it that those lightning storms will hit our building? And how likely is it that that lightning strike on the building will cause data loss? We can assign something like once a week, once a year, once every 10 years, or some other numerical probability to the likelihood of that event. Then the impact. Well, what happens if that threat does actually take place? What if lightning does strike the building, we lose data? Do we have backups? Do we have that data in other places? Could we reconstruct that information? Or would we lose it? And how much would it cost us if we lost that information? That's the impact. Usually we analyze impact from low to high. As we do this risk analysis, we may chart the results. So you can imagine a diagram that has probability on one axis and impact on the other. And we may place each of the different threats into a certain box, analyzing what the risk of each of these different threats is. Now, risk management is all about dealing with these particular threats. Now, obviously, we want to mitigate as many of the threats as we can. And by mitigate, it means we want to reduce the probability in the impact. The reality is, it's almost impossible to reduce the probability or impact of a threat down to absolutely nothing. There will always be some probability or some impact of each of those different threats, but we want to reduce it as much as possible. As an example, redundancy can reduce the impact of a hardware failure. So let's just say that we determine that it's actually a very high probability that we will have a lightning strike and that it will damage our information. And maybe the impact of that particular information being lost is really high. So it's going to be in this box up here. If we add redundancy, for example, another hard drive in another location that has the same information or cloud backups of some sort, we may be able to reduce the impact of that lightning strike so that it's a low impact, but still a high probability. If we moved our facility out of the location where lightning strikes are a high probability, we might also be able to move it down to a low probability. So in that way, we've taken a threat, which was a high impact, high probability, added redundancy or moved physical locations, and moved it down into a low impact, low probability. Security appliances are another way to reduce the probability of certain events, such as cyber attacks. By adding those particular security appliances, we may be able to move more of these threats down into the low probability boxes. Now, this is a simplified chart with only 4 boxes. We may have even more boxes on a more in-depth risk analysis. However, realize that the threats in the high probability, high impact box are the ones that we want to take the most steps to reducing that probability and impact. Ideally, if we can put measures in place to reduce all of these to low impact, low probability, that would be ideal. Some of these different threats may cost more than others to move. For example, if we have issues in confidentiality or people using the wrong systems, simple passwords, which are free and very easy to implement, may reduce a high probability, high impact threat down into a low probability, low impact threat. The next question becomes, well, how do we know what threats we face? How do we do this threat modeling piece? Well, part of it is education. You need to learn from other people what threats are actually out there in the world today. Part of it will come from past experience. What threats have you encountered? And others will take some creative thinking to figure out what threats are we going to face. The next question, how do we know how to mitigate them? Again, starts with education. You need to know what your options are and how we can reduce the probability and impact of those particular threats.